Hello and welcome to the EV Life podcast. I'm your host, Crystal Maharaj, and I'm joined by
Allison Bench, the producer of the EV Life podcast.
And today our episode is with FortisAlberta. So we're joined by Jennifer Shillam and Dave Hunka, both from FortisAlberta, and they're here to talk to us about some of the services that Fortis is introducing to assist those people living particularly in rural Alberta access better charging infrastructure for EVs.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that is something that we hear quite a lot. Like even we've met a lot of AMA members and Albertans who people say, you know, I live rurally, so how could I ever have an EV? But
right.
Fortis is actually actively working in that space to try to improve it. So we thought it was really important to have them on and learn a little bit more about what they're doing in that area. So I think this is a super important conversation. And of course, they're an energy provider. So we also chat with them about the grid, which is another thing that comes up quite often when you're thinking about Alberta's future with EVs. Like, how is the grid going to handle it? So,
you know, Allison and I attend a lot of events where we go out and talk to Albertans about electric vehicles, and two of the big concerns that we hear are about grid capacity. A lot of people are concerned that our grid cannot sustain mass adoption of EVs. And also, again, as Allison mentioned, a lot of people say, well, you know, EVs might be great for the cities, but not so much for rural Alberta. And so I feel like if you share those concerns or just curious to hear what a utilities company has to say about that, then this is a great episode for you because Jennifer and Dave really touch on those, and it was such an enlightening conversation.
Yeah, I think let's just dive right in and take a listen to that great interview.
All right, without further ado, here is my conversation with Jennifer Shillam and Dave Hunka of FortisAlberta. Hello, Jennifer and Dave. Thank you so much for joining me on the podcast today.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
So can you just share with our audience a little bit about your roles at Fortis? We'll start with you, Jennifer.
Yeah, definitely. So I am an advisor in Fortis's Emerging Customer Solutions Department. It's a fairly new role within the organization. Our focus is anything outside of core business for the company.
Thank you so much. And Dave, yourself?
So I've been with the company for 16 years in different departments, from operations to customer service. So different experiences there, but right now I just moved over as of yesterday to this team. Mm-hmm. So it's been very exciting the last couple of days, and so I'm glad Jen's here to definitely answer some of these questions.
Well, we're so glad to have both of you here. And for our audience who might not have heard of Fortis, can you just share a little bit about the company and how FortisAlberta is assisting with EV charging infrastructure?
Yeah, so FortisAlberta is a distribution company. I'll take it one level higher for people who perhaps don't understand the grid as a whole. It can be confusing. There's really four key components, and that is generation, transmission, distribution, and retail. So generation produces it, transmission moves higher voltages to substations where it can be consumed, distribution moves those consumption levels to everywhere where it's needed, and then retail does the bill. So distribution is where we are. FortisAlberta does pretty much 60% of all distribution services in Alberta. So we have a pretty big portfolio. That's about 600,000 customers, about 1 million poles, and the power line to go along with that could essentially wrap around the earth 3 times. So
just kind of not small.
Not small, yep.
And how is Fortis assisting Alberta with EV charging infrastructure?
Yeah, so the organization really has 2 major initiatives that we've got going on right now. The first is our new rate. It's called Rate 62 for electric vehicle fast charging. So it became available in September, and it targets infrastructure, fast charging infrastructure, or those DC chargers. Range anxiety is seen as a large barrier to EV adoption, rightly so, of course. And a lot of those bigger chargers out there only work with a certain brand of EV. I won't.
Yeah, no, I think our audience knows, but.
And they're mostly found in large urban areas, right? So you're looking at the Edmontons, the Red Deers, Calgarys, sort of those EV corridors is where you find those superchargers. So outside of that, there isn't a lot of those bigger fast chargers. And that's what our rate 62 tries to target. Those big chargers need a lot of demand, and Fortis's standard rates focused on demand, which, is great. The company has an agnostic approach to, serving customers. Our responsibility is to make sure that the power is there safely and reliably, not what you're going to be using it for.
Right.
But when you get lower utilization at a service, like a charger that's in the Monarchs of the world or the Bonaccords of the world, where perhaps EV adoption isn't as high, what happens is that those charges that go along with those demand can be cost prohibitive. So that's where rate 62 comes in. Instead of focusing on the demand of these larger charges, it focuses on the usage. So while EV adoption is lower in those rural areas, those early adopters of that infrastructure aren't hit with such high costs to be able to put that charger in. So we're really hoping that what'll happen is that it'll incentivize individuals who were maybe on the fence about putting in those larger chargers to put them in, capitalizing on provincial or even economic development funding opportunities that are out there right now that help pay for the equipment, and then supplemented with this rate. Now maybe we'll see more chargers out there in the, far out regions.
This is interesting. You bring up an interesting point about those fast chargers are in the urban areas centers, right? So why were these rural areas kind of on your radar? Why was it important to bring the fast charging to the rural areas?
I think anyone who is in a smaller community has probably experienced that feeling that rural Alberta is sort of the forgotten areas, I guess you could say. I live in a small community, and I know I have trouble with my broadband, and,
right.
I just don't have the same services that are available. I think a big focus is that historically Fortis's footprint has been in that rural area and supporting that rural area. I mean, the company's gone through a million different name changes throughout its years. It started as Calgary Power. And back then, they started a service called Farm Electric Services, and they partnered with farmers and rural Albertans, even back then, to bring power to rural Alberta. So there was, large stretches of power line that perhaps don't have the same customer density on them. There's not as big a rate of return on it, right? So what happened is that the rural Albertans partnered with the utility that had the expertise to actually make sure that the power line worked properly, brought that out to rural Alberta. And that's really been the history of the organization.
It
moving
sounds like
forward.
Fortis has a long history of serving rural Alberta. And so it was important to continue with that tradition, right, of serving people in areas that sometimes can be forgotten. And
Definitely.
We've heard from a lot of our audience who live in urban areas and want to adopt EVs and start, purchasing and using EVs, that is a big barrier to them buying it. So really important for those people on the cusp, right?
I think the other thing too is there are a lot of companies that are coming to Alberta right now that are looking to develop their own EV corridors. Mm-hmm. And there's a couple different models that are kind of out there. And this rate really helps a lot with that development, especially in areas that might not have the same traffic and flow through that other areas do. We're seeing more and more development around that. So I'm pretty positive with this new rate. It should be a really good pickup for those customers to make it a lot more affordable.
And when did you introduce rate 62?
It became available on September 20th.
So, we've spoken to so many different people on the podcast, and one of the biggest concerns that we hear from listeners, and it's just, I think if you Google myths or concerns about EVs, one of the biggest things that comes up is, well, I don't think that our power grid can support it. And we've spoken to numerous people on the podcast and gotten their opinion on whether or not they agree with that concern. Is it valid? Is it maybe just misplaced fear? What's your thoughts on it? Do you think our power grid can support mass adoption of EVs?
So on the technical side, just like any new load customer that comes through the door, we always find a way to arrange and get the customer connected. And we're constantly looking at our standards as far as construction and so forth around making sure that the system is easily upgradable. But there is sometimes, of course, when customers are either so far away from existing main line or the load that they're looking for is so large, there's upfront costs that the customer has to pay to connect to the system.
Yeah, and I would say it's always an interesting conversation whenever we get into this, especially that, that mass adoption. I always find a conversation about that turns into a qualitative conversation because, EV adoption is definitely on the rise for sure. And like I mentioned, we're really hoping that Rate 62 can help with that infrastructure and remove that range anxiety and better support that adoption rate. But we also have to think about it from the perspective that there isn't really an EV watershed moment. Like a lot of people focus on 2035,
right?
And the mandates from the federal government. But, we're still not going to see a 100% EV penetration as of January 1st. It's not everyone's going to hand in their keys to their combustion engine on that day, right? So mass adoption is not exactly mass adoption. You look at it historically, in the 50s, people had 60 amp panels in their homes, and then it's transitioned to 100 amp panels now, and now we're seeing 200 amp. As looking to go to a standard or higher. So it's that gradual, and we'll be there to meet it.
We're even seeing in other jurisdictions in BC and Ontario that for home panels, they're looking to convert, because they're also looking at fuel switching, so getting rid of natural gas completely, going to 400 amp and 600 amp panels, which, to our standards right now, that's a huge shift.
Right.
Other things that we're also doing and looking at is new technology. And one thing I forgot to mention is just we do have a pilot project where we're looking to convert to DC power in between, basically in a neighborhood where you have the transformer to basically up to the metering placement on the side of the house. That would be run at DC, direct current. So that would save a lot of costs as far as upgrades, because some of those costs to upgrade those secondary wires and so forth could be as high as $20,000 per home, where this could lower that to being under $5,000 per home.
So a huge savings.
Huge savings. So we are doing an active test with that technology to see how it's going to work. And I think the other thing too, just within the industry, we've seen some talk around solid state batteries that have the capabilities of getting 80% of their charge within 7 minutes. So that's some pretty groundbreaking new battery technology.
Yeah, and I know a lot of people are looking forward to that becoming available in the near future. But it sounds like what you're saying, and some of our former guests have kind of said the same thing. Everyone's not going out tomorrow and purchasing an EV. So with gradual adoption of EVs, so too will there be gradual upgrades to our power grid. And so it seems like you're not concerned that we're going to have an overload in the next year or 2 years, or even, the federal mandate comes in 2035, but everyone's not turning in their keys to their ICE vehicles and, swapping it out for an EV. So can we say whenever that happens, whenever mass adoption of EVs happens in Canada, it's not likely that our grid would not be able to support that just with the gradual upgrades?
I would say that all market participants on the electrical grid are going to rise to the challenge to do what we can to ensure that Albertans continue to receive reliable and safe power. And it's exactly what you said. Like I myself own a classic car from 1979. It's older than I am. I am not going to, we won't ask how many years Dave is older than it. But and exactly that, like it's going to be with me for a long time, and a lot of ICE vehicles are going to be with people for a long time. Not saying that there isn't areas of the grid that perhaps don't incur, issues because of large adoption of charging infrastructure. Supercharger and stations have a lot of demand. So it's not saying it's not saying that they won't see some issues or, in older residential neighborhoods. But I think the focus is really looking at emerging technologies, looking at ways that we can innovate and really meet that challenge to ensure that we're keeping costs low and ensuring that we're, doing the best that we can to get people their power.
Just to add to that too, I think when Jen also mentions new technology, a lot of these EV facilities are actually installing battery chargers with those systems. And that also keep the costs down, but also allows them to charge when it might be more affordable. And in some cases too, we are also seeing customers that have gone with EVs also looking at installing solar at home along with battery backup and battery storage. I mean, we're also doing an EV charging pilot project, and we're actually actively watching people that have EVs, how they're charging, when they're charging, how long they're charging for, and then with the technology that we're able to see, and then also they can also work with us around when they want to charge, and it overall balances the load in the area for what's taking place. So it's pretty neat in the sense that you can say, well, I want to have my car fully charged by tomorrow at 5. It will balance out those kind of requests, and you can still override it, of course. But it's interesting how that technology is to help flatten out that curve so you don't get these big peaks when everyone comes home from work and they want to plug their car in.
Right.
So
you mentioned the solid state batteries, and I'm just curious to get your thoughts on this because that is kind of like a hot topic right now in the EV world. So how can you explain, just for our listeners who might not know, how would solid state batteries reduce that sort of strain on the power grid? Because like you said, they're able to charge very quickly.
So if you had a charging facility that also had the battery backup, the nice thing is the customer is going to get charged very, very quickly, but they can drain down their battery and they're not actually pulling power from the grid at that time. And if the demand overall, because a lot of times we'll have multiple battery systems there per charger, that allows them that they don't, that they can get charged at when there isn't as much demand. Type of thing. So it helps them control their demand costs. Right. It makes them more affordable, and it also allows that customer to come in and get quickly charged. When I started to do some reading on the solid state batteries, I was pretty impressed of where it might go. So
exciting things. Well, thank you both so much for joining me on the podcast today. Before we wrap up, is there anything else you'd like to share with our audience?
I think the biggest thing that I would impose upon people is that, I'm hoping there's either listeners that already have electric vehicles or people out there that are considering it. And if you are considering an electric vehicle, the biggest thing that I can stress that we find surprises people is maybe they go and they purchase the vehicle and they purchase that upgraded level 2 charger because they, don't want to use their level 1 that comes standard with the vehicle. Please contact an electrician before you do that, because we have had customers who have spent, quite a bit of money on this technology, and then they go home and find out that their current panel in their home or even the current system within their neighborhood can't accommodate the load, and then they're facing additional charges. So that can be a big surprise for individuals and can also be cost prohibitive for them. So they've just spent all this money on a vehicle and now they can't charge it with this level 2 charger that they've purchased. So just trying to spare some people some surprises or potential headaches. Contact an electrician. On Fortis Alberta's website, on our electric vehicle landing page, we have what we call our load guide. If you're electrically inclined, have a read. If not, contact an electrician.
That's great advice. Thank you so much, Jennifer. Was there anything else you wanted to add?
Just really quickly, I think the other thing that we're focusing on is also working with the developers for new subdivisions and making sure that the right infrastructure is going in, and having those conversations around, is there going to be EVs and things like this, especially with people that own homes that want to upgrade things to consider is, if you're looking to do EV and you have a hot water or a hot tub and air conditioning, then you're probably looking at a 200 amp service type of thing.
So what I'm hearing from you all is you really need to do your research before you go out and make these big purchases, just to make sure you're prepared.
Definitely.
Thank you both so much for joining me on the podcast. This was an excellent conversation.
Thank you for having us.
I hope you enjoyed my conversation with Jennifer and Dave from Fortis Alberta. If you have any questions about the episode or would like to just weigh in, you can always find Allison and myself in our EV Life community on the AMA mobile app. You can also send us an email at community@ama.av.ca. And of course, don't forget to subscribe to this podcast so you never miss an episode. We'll talk to you in the next one.